Well, for a closer look at how the coronavirus pandemic is changing the media industry, let's bring in Bruce Shapiro from New York. Bruce is an executive director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, a project of Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Thank you for joining me.
Very glad to be here.
So as we know, the value and demand for media and information usually spikes during a crisis. How are we seeing that playing out during COVID-19?
Well, there's a kind of paradox. The paradox is that there's an absolutely desperate need for accurate information, for journalists to bear witness to the experiences of the communities most affected by this horrible pandemic, and for accountability for governments all over the world as they try to respond to the coronavirus crisis. That's the classical role of journalism in disaster. It's not just about being the news. It's about being a kind of stand-in for ordinary citizens who often feel that no one else will recognize them, no one else will represent what they're suffering, and no one else will communicate outward to them what they need to know. The paradox is that at this moment, all over the world, as your introduction put it, journalism is in an economic crisis, especially local journalism. And so some of the places hardest hit by news, but by the pandemic,
right,
may not get the kind of coverage they deserve. Take New Orleans in Louisiana. When Hurricane Katrina swept across New Orleans in 2005, the city had two major daily newspapers, a host of television stations, a host of alternative weeklies. In this current crisis, the number of daily newspapers has been cut in half. In fact, the newspaper which won the Pulitzer Prize for its coverage, the Times-Picayune, was bought and folded into another daily. There's no more alternative weekly, and it's, we're seeing the shrinking of local news capacity.
Right. I do want to touch on something. Now, obviously, we're seeing some aspects of media threatened more than others. Obviously, you have things like broadcast, you have print, you have new media. Are they all facing the same sort of challenges?
Well, yes and no. I mean, certainly newspapers, or what we would describe as legacy media, are facing an economic crunch that has been a generation in the making and is now being pushed to the absolute limit by the collapse of advertising during the coronavirus. And that's the lifeline of small communities is very often, the daily newspaper. There's a lot of exciting stuff happening in new media and a lot of vigor in the largest news organizations like the New York Times or News Corp. But even in those very large corporations and even in new media, there is a tremendous amount of economic contraction that's going on for a while. And at the same time, it needs to be said that across the world, journalists are also being pressed by authoritarian leaders who are clamping down on journalists who ask too many questions, sometimes too many questions about coronavirus.
Now, I do want to look at Facebook because they committed $100 million to help local news outlets who've been hit hard by the pandemic. What's your take on this short-term fix, especially given that Facebook itself is increasingly becoming a main source of news for so many people?
Well, we don't yet know exactly what Facebook's intervention is going to look like. But, throughout history, governments and corporations have intervened to support news outlets at one time or another. In the very early history of the United States, one of the first acts of the United States Congress back in 1790 was to enact a postal subsidy for newspapers of general interest so that regardless of party, communities around the U.S. could get something like the news. It's hard. You can make money in news, but it's also, there's a lot of the news business where it's a public service. And so increasingly we need to understand the role of nonprofit news or of technically profit-making, but basically public service-driven news, which is going to take some combination of philanthropic or social foundation national support to survive.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your insights. Bruce Shapiro there, Executive Director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, a project of Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism.